further ado, let me introduce the next speaker, which is Sébastien Picault. Sébastien, senior researcher at INRA in France. And he will tell us today how two contrasting fattening systems, so between Europe and the US, how they impact BVD in cattle. The floor is yours, Sébastien.
Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction. So I'm sharing my screen, so you should see it in full screen now. Yes, okay. So good morning. I'm from the BioEPAR unit in Nantes, and I'm going to present you a model that we developed in collaboration with Brad White and David Amrin from the Kansas State University, in addition to Pauline Desano and Sébastien Assier from the same unit as me. So the goal of this study was to compare the impact of farming practices on bovine respiratory disease. So to make it short, in this study, we are focusing on fattening farms where BRD are a serious concern for many reasons. First, they occur very frequently, especially at the beginning of the fattening period. They are complex because they involve multiple pathogens, bacteria and viruses, and their onset is associated with several risk factors. Among them, the most prominent are the number of breeders that are involved to take animals from different farms and to build the batches, and also the distance that the young beef birds have to travel from the breeder farm to the fattening farms before the fattening itself starts. Such respiratory, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, I'm a bit too, yeah, sorry for the wrong slide here. And of course, such respiratory disease have an impact on animal welfare. They also can be lethal in some cases, and they reduce the weight intake, which induces strong economic losses for farmers. So, of course, the need for farmers to control BRD often leads to a high antimicrobial usage, which, as you know, is problematic in the current necessity of antibiotic reduction. To contribute to BRD control, we think that mechanistic models can help better understand the main determinants of transmission and hence identify possible levers that can be used to elaborate control strategies and also to assess those strategies ex ante. So for instance, in the context of human beef bulls fattening, a first risky step is the formation of batches coming from various breeders, because of the diversity of pathogens that animals can carry, that can be susceptible to, and so on. The risk level resulting from pen formation is not assessed in the French farming practices. So yet, in a recent study, a former colleague of us, Thibaut Morel-Journel, has shown that, in fact, rewiring trade movements could contribute to reduce the risk at pen formation. But now I'm going to focus rather on what happened next during the fattening period itself, and especially through the detection and the interaction between detection and treatment. Detection can rely upon, of course, a visual identification of clinical signs, especially signs such as depression. And also, it can be based on a measurement of burst temperature, which can be done either manually or in a precision agriculture perspective through sensors that can be, for instance, intraruminal boluses. And regarding treatments, they can either target individuals or the whole pen. They can be also repeated over time according to veterinary protocols. And they can also be compared to alternatives such as animal isolation. So as you can see, there are a lot of options that can be combined to design and assess a lot of control scenarios. So what I'm going to present is based on a previous BRD model, which was mechanistic, stochastic, individual-based, and it was also designed to represent typical French or European BRD farms, in which there are a small number of animals, about 10 in each pen. So in this model, we assumed also an average pathogen because it's very complicated to address the multiple pathogens at this point. And we also try to account at the same time for interactions between the infectious process, the onset of hyperthermia, which can occur without any infection, and the treatment. Also, we focused on a few research questions, especially we tried to identify cost-effective strategies in terms of how to combine detection methods and treatment protocols, especially regarding the trade-off between reducing the duration of infection at pen scale and also reducing antimicrobial usage. And we could find, for instance, interesting and counterintuitive usage of policies. Also, just a word about the way we developed this model. We used a new software approach called Emulsion, which comes with its own modeling language, which is a kind of structured text. And the added value of doing so was to facilitate interactions between modelers and non-modeler scientists, such as veterinarians, but also to help revising assumptions without having to change anything in the simulation code. And that proved very useful for the next step, because the model that was developed in the first place was limited to a very specific context with few animals. And so we were very eager to extend it to larger farming systems to assess especially the generality of our findings. So at this point, we got in touch with Brad White and David Amrin from Kansas State University to investigate how to extend this model. And of course, very soon it appeared that representing US farming practices was not only a matter of pen size, and that several assumptions had to be changed. So the first major difference comes from antimicrobial usage, because in the US system, the risk level associated to pens, depending on their composition, is assessed and taken into account. So some pens are known to be low or high risk to develop BRD, and some pens even receive a prior treatment with long-range antibiotics. So of course, this reduces BRD impact, but it also results in a delayed onset of BRD cases. So we decided to add an additional health state representing individuals that carry pathogens without being yet infectious nor symptomatic. So that was the first major change in the model. So we focused also on the question of cost effectiveness, how to reduce both disease duration and antimicrobial usage if possible. Also, we found that in contrary to French pens, where mortality is quite rare, mortality could not be neglected anymore. So we developed a more precise description of the onset of clinical signs to account for that. And finally, we separated also the detection process from the treatment. So here you have an overview of the resulting BRD model, which currently integrates 5 distinct processes: infection, hyperthermia, the onset of clinical signs, the detection, and the treatment protocol. So these processes can evolve on their own, but they also have explicit couplings. So these diagrams were generated automatically by emulsion from the model description, so I won't go into all details. But for instance, if we consider an individual that becomes infectious here, it also becomes hyperthermic and starts expressing mild clinical signs, possibly leading then to severe clinical signs, or even, if not treated, for instance, to death. And these severe clinical signs, in turn, enable visual detection and subsequently the treatment, which can end the infection and so on. So, as you can see, there are several ways to move from one state to another one, because all possible conditions and transitions are made explicit in the diagrams. This, of course, contributes to interacting very easily on the structure and assumptions of the model to ensure its soundness. Okay, so I'm just focusing a bit on one of the main assumptions that we made in the new model. So in the previous version, we considered only a simple SIS infection dynamics, which led to rather basic epidemic curve. So to better account for delayed BRD onset, especially when long-range antibiotics are used, we introduced a new state to represent asymptomatic and non-infectious carriers. So these individuals are the only source of infection in the pen and will eventually become infectious after a delay that varies depending on individuals. But also, in the meanwhile, they can anyway become infectious, exactly like susceptible animals, due to the presence of other infectious animals in the pen. Okay, so in addition to the French system, we set up 3 different scenarios for your US farming system, because as I have said, in contrast to what is done in French fattening farms, the assessment risk level at pen formation results in 3 categories, characterized by the proportion of BRD cases that can occur, that are likely to occur, and possibly the need to treat all animals before fattening starts. So we calibrated the parameters of the new model and initial conditions according to existing US data, mainly regarding morbidity and lethality. And then we compared the simulation results with the French scenario. Now, if we look at the results, we can first consider the onset of clinical signs here. So here you can see the average number of animals with severe clinical signs over time during the first 100 days after pen formation. So this is calculated over 500 stochastic repetitions for each scenario. So here the French one, the US low risk scenario, and here the 2 high risk scenarios. So there is a clear difference in peak height depending on risk level. And we can see also that the expected, we can see here the expected delay between the delay in BRD onset due to prior treatment in the high-risk scenario with metaphylaxis. So far, this is rather what was expected. We can also look at the distribution of detection dates, which also show a sharper dynamics in high-risk scenarios here. Also in French and low-risk scenario, what is very interesting is that most cases occur, of course, in the 2 or 3 first weeks, which is quite expected, but there are also a few cases occurring later during fattening, which is closer to what is observed in real situations. So now let's consider one of our main concerns, the balance at pen scale between disease duration and antimicrobial usage. So here we summarize the 4 scenarios with a total duration in animal days in the x-axis and the number of doses used during the fattening phase in the y-axis. So the dots represent the medians here, and the boxes represent the first and third quartiles. So it appears that the 2 high-risk scenarios are close, as expected, and that the US and low-risk scenarios are also quite similar. But of course, we have to take into account first the additional doses used in antibiotic prevention in one of the high-risk scenarios. And also, this represents only what occurs in one pen, and pens do not have the same size. So now, if we count the antibiotic prevention doses, this makes the situation more explicit. But also, if we scale the French system to evaluate the cumulative disease duration and number of doses to raise 100 animals in 10 pens, we can see that the US low-risk scenario is very efficient compared to the French system. So to summarize, this study highlighted the interest of taking into account an asymptomatic carriage of pathogens for accounting for a more realistic modeling of BRD. And in fact, this mechanism was introduced to represent feature from the US farming system, but it also appeared to improve the realism of a French scenario. But also our results suggest that the risk levels at pen formation would certainly deserve a special attention in the French system, especially in the absence of early BRD detection. This would certainly make possible to apply different treatment protocols depending on the risk level, or as suggested by Timo Borrell's journal in the study I mentioned, to reduce the risk level itself at pen formation. And conversely, the high prevalence of BRD in high-risk US pens suggests that early detection methods, even maybe on a part of the pen, could be beneficial to stop the spread as soon as possible. So this raises interesting questions that certainly will provide us with interesting work in the coming months. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much for a really good talk. Are there any questions already? If not, I start. I hope I see everybody asking. So please write in the chat if I ignore you. Yeah, I may kick off. So my first question was, when you contrast the UK and the US system, so you realize there's very different management and involved with that, and different things you needed to implement in your model. How different were the data that you're getting? You know, is the US much better data? Did you have completely different data quality as well? Was that comparable?
We had a few data from 60 pens in high risk and 60 pens in low risk scenario, which are rather the cumulative number of clinical cases over time. So I would say that data are rather not very detailed at this stage. In France, it's difficult to have data in general, but on this very specific issue, my colleague Sébastien Assier has recorded a lot of longitudinal data on pens equipped with intraluminal boluses. So we have a more detailed account of what happens in French pens.
Right. Okay. Thanks. Are there any other questions? I don't see any in the chat. Am I looking at the right place? So if you have a question, just pitch in. Right, I have another question, so that gives me an opportunity. So I noticed in your model assumption, you assumed, so the asymptomatic carriers are always a nightmare in these models, right? Because you never know. But you assume that asymptomatic carriers can become infectious when they have contact with infectious individuals.
Yeah.
I found this very surprising. Can you maybe describe or talk a little bit more why you assume that? Yeah.
It's because the pathogens involved in BRD can be transmitted from individuals to others, as many respiratory pathogens, of course, but they can also live for a very long time in the respiratory system of the animals. So it's very difficult to find the balance between animals that would be really infectious at the very start of the fattening and individuals that just carry pathogens and will trigger the disease because of stress or any events like that. So we considered that we introduced animals only with pathogens carried in their organism. And of course, there is a distribution of duration for the trigger of infectiousness from these pathogens. And then once one animal becomes infectious, we consider that it could infect all other animals. Also because we have a kind of average pathogen. We didn't represent explicitly the diversity of pathogens, but of course, if you're carrying one of the pathogen, you can be infected by another one. So that was a way to balance the diversity of pathogens without having an explicit multi-pathogen model.
Okay, thanks. I understand. I see a question of Elisa.
Yes, thank you, Sébastien. Just a quick question, maybe. So you correct me if I'm wrong. So here you modeled just one farm, I mean one herd. That's
one
it.
pen.
Yeah, and what about considering a meta population, not necessarily all the French system, and combining herds with at low risk, at high risk? I mean, different scenarios. Did you?
Yeah, that's something that we are going to certainly consider in the coming months, because it was what Thibaut Morel-Journel has done in his study. He considered several farms with diversity of pathogens, and then how these pathogens can according to the way we build patches from animal movements, the diversity of pathogens that are present in one pen. So is stopped at this point. And of course, we could use exactly the same configuration to initialize the pen with the corresponding risk level, for instance, to better understand how this can develop afterwards during fattening. So that's something that we could study. But
okay.
yeah.
No, just continue. Sorry, I wouldn't want to.
Yeah, but at this point, I think this would require to have a true multi-pathogen model, and it's a bit complicated still at this point. What Thibault did is to consider theoretical pathogens. See, so of course, to parameterize this correctly, we would have to be very to have more data about the prevalence of each kind of pathogen, its transmission rate, and so on. So it's very complicated to get all this information now.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So if there are no further questions, thank you very much, Sebastian.